Hello, and welcome to Chapter 17 of your textbook. We're going to be talking about Europe in the centuries around the 15th, 16th, 17th, and a little bit into the 18th. Now, this is a chapter that's just packed full of information. Normally, when I teach Western civilization, this represents at least 4 different chapters. But here in world history, we're going to condense it into just one. So, uh, without further ado, let's jump into this. So, the truly important thing to understand about what is happening in Europe during this time, 1450 to 1750, is that the way people are thinking and believing will be changing. It's not just a matter of new information. It is how people are going to absorb that information, how they're going to understand that information, how they're going to spread that information, and how they're going to convince other people to understand and to believe in a different manner than they had been for hundreds of years. So we'll be talking, generally speaking, around Europe, although there'll be a few ramifications outside of Europe. But we are talking about some very densely populated areas, such as the area we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. Uh, this is in your book. It will be described as the Netherlands or the lowlands. We'll be talking about Paris, the Italian peninsula, and the Holy Roman Empire. So, as of yet, we don't have the concepts of nations. We have kingdoms or constitutional monarchies, and we have colonies and other ways to describe these lands. But we are going to see the very basic beginnings of the ideas of nationalism and how people will identify with countries a little bit later on. But first, we have to tie this era into what you learned in chapter 16. And a big part of that will be the fall of Constantinople. Not that Europe uh, really had a huge difference in terms of uh, trade with the loss of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, but many of the people, the Greek Orthodox, well-educated, Greek-speaking people who had been in Constantinople managed to escape before the Ottoman Turks took the city over. Some of them went to Russia, and they'll be part of Russia's history, and many of them went to Europe. They were all carrying as many books as they could possibly carry. You see, Europeans had not really studied Greek. Only a handful of people had studied Greek. Meanwhile, the people of Constantinople, of the Byzantine Empire, were speaking Greek, and they had a practice that had been handed down since the earliest days of the Byzantine Empire in copying ancient texts. What this meant in Russia, in Russia as well, but in Europe, is that we had a huge influx of people who were highly literate, who could teach everybody else Greek, and they were bringing Greek texts that the Europeans either did not know about or had only heard about tangentially or had read parts of them in Latin, in bastardized texts. So to get a hold of all of these new classical texts means that the intellectual people of Europe are going to be speaking in a different language, or at least reading in a different language, and they are going to be learning about a whole range of philosophers and ancient scientists that they had never heard of before or had heard a little bit of. People like Socrates and Plato are all of a sudden going to be very popular, and uh, these are to our minds today. These are very uh, uh, important, almost inescapably important people in the history of philosophy. Uh, but the Europeans had not known much about them because they could not read the texts about them. And one of the upshots of this influx of ancient texts, people are going to be reading them voraciously, and they're going to be thinking differently. They're going to be picking up new ideas from these texts. And so, from these texts and new learning, we're going to see a development of humanism, the idea that the world can be measured at a human scale, that humans can learn from each other, that we can grow and improve ourselves through a study of classical literature and questioning. And that's a huge part of the Renaissance. Uh, One thing that is also going to come about at the exact same time as the fall of Constantinople is the printing press. Uh, Johannes Gutenberg will have invented what we call movable type. In other words, each letter gets its own piece of type. I'll describe that a little bit more detail in class, but it meant that books could be printed faster and cheaper and more and more and more copies. So instead of a handful of scribes laboring over texts for weeks, months, years, sometimes, depending on how long the text was, um, a a suitably set up workshop with printing presses could do it within days or weeks and turn out thousands of copies at a time. And the books will be cheaper and people will get a hold of them. And this is significant because before, with the hand copied works, you might have to go to a monastery somewhere to pick up a copy of a book that you were interested in reading. Well, you couldn't check it out. You had to sit there and read it while you were at the monastery. And then you would maybe want to compare it to a different text that you know of, but it's 200 miles away at a different monastery. So you have to travel and then again read that text there. But you had better hope you made good notes from the other text, because how do you compare them? Well, with the printing press, with cheaper books, you now have both texts in front of you and you can start comparing them. And what happens is that we are going to have intellectuals of this time who are going to be taking their current texts, such as uh, the Bible, the New Testament especially, and they're going to be pulling up ancient Greek, or at least older Greek copies of the same book. And as they're comparing them, they're going to find major differences. And so we see an entire group of intellectuals who are going to be questioning the current model. They're not going to be questioning the old Greek stuff. They're going to look at the older Greek materials and say, this is closer to the actual happening, therefore it's more authentic or accurate. It's our new things that over the course of a millennia and a half have changed. Um, so it's important to know that the Renaissance was not just about reading new texts, but reading new texts in new languages, in texts that were not available, that all of a sudden are available to compare. So this printing press is going to do a lot more than just print books cheaper and faster. It is going to create an intellectual revolution. Another aspect of what we will see going forward is the idea of the state as its own identity or entity. Sorry about that. So it has to do with identity, that all of a sudden people are not uh, uh, citizens or peasants that live in a particular village and they identify with the village. Now they're identifying with a bigger concept, that they are subjects of a king, a large centralized state. And so their worlds, even though many of them might not be literate, they might not be picking up on the new learning of this age, but in their day-to-day lives, their focus is going to be bigger on a bigger entity known as the state. And we're talking not states like the state of California and the state of Nevada. We're talking about the power structure, the administration. All of these are going to affect the peasants at a very granular level. We're going to see the state influence all sorts of things that it had not influenced before, because it is taking power unto itself and using it. One of the key texts of statecraft, how to get power and how to keep power, two very different questions, will be a book by a man from Florence by the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. He had been a diplomat in the Republic of Florence, uh, had been entrusted with very important work. But Florence is going to change at this moment from a republic that was run by a group of wealthy individuals to a, a more of an oligarchy, but ruled by a dynasty of a particular family. And that family, you need to know them because I'm going to talk about them a lot in this chapter. The Medici family. They will be uh, extremely wealthy bankers, very powerful, and they're going to use their money and their power to take over Florence. They will be the rulers of Florence. And people like Machiavelli will lose their jobs. But Machiavelli is interested in getting his job back from the de' Medici family. And so he writes a book for the head of the de' Medici family, a man by the name of Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Um, and this book describes how to get power and how to keep power. Now, it is a quantum leap from other books that are written at the time, because a lot of the other books are influenced by things like Christian theology. And so there are clearly demarcated in the other books of the time a sense of right and wrong, a sense of always doing the right things so that you can go to heaven. None of that sort of theological discussion is in Machiavelli's book. He is not telling his reader how to be good or bad. He is keeps a fairly neutral outlook as far as good or bad in terms of the personal theological, religious, spiritual aspects. But his intention is to show the leadership how to make the strongest state possible and how to keep that power. Uh, so he's suggesting things that shocked people at the time, even today, are fairly shocking. For example, Machiavelli asks, should the prince always speak the truth? Machiavelli says, when you can't speak the truth, then you need to lie. There might be situations. Just don't get caught. Um, that to our ears, and definitely to the ears of the people back in this time, was pretty shocking. So it's an important text. You will probably have to read it at some point in your college career. I know I had to read it a couple of times. My copy's pretty dog-eared, uh, but it's a very short and interesting book. And I will put a link into the module about Machiavelli so you can learn a little bit more from him. Uh, One of the things that rich people like Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de' Medici, and other wealthy people in Europe did was to put money into the arts. They wanted to show themselves as being wealthy, as being influential, as being having good taste. And so the people who are going to benefit are the artists, who all of a sudden will get jobs, they'll get commissions, they'll get uh, paid to do paintings and sculptures, where before it would have been very difficult to get these kind of commissions. And so art is going to uh, change in such a way as to catch the attention of the people who are going to buy it. And so the work had to be more, I don't want to say better, because that's not the right spirit we want to capture, but more evocative, more based on very realistic principles. And so at this time, in the arts. We're going to see an interest in the art of classical Greece and Rome. They're literally going to be digging up statues from ancient Greece and ancient Rome and displaying them for the first time in hundreds of years, and then copying them and bringing into the arts the classical mythology, instead of concentrating strictly on Christian theology. And realism is going to become valued over the more medieval senses of how to create a picture and display it. We're going to see all of a sudden new techniques in the arts sprout up that are going to address this hyper realistic um, desire. As I said, these artists are going to have to set themselves apart from other artists, and so consequently, their work is going to be far greater embellished. Once we get through this Renaissance period of art, we're going to go into a different period known as the Baroque. And if you thought that things were embellished and beautiful in the Renaissance, you ain't seen nothing until you see the Baroque period. It is an explosion of um, of the fanciest thing you can imagine. Flowers and cherubs and everything's coated in gold, and it's outrageous is the only word I can ever think about it. I have to get rid of my annotations. So here are a handful of bits of art and architecture that we're going to be seeing in the Renaissance that really portray what the Renaissance was about. We see um, a art that's depicting regular life, that is showing things that's starting to get in a very hyper realistic format, but this is not a religious subject at all. These are people out uh, mowing down the hay, they're harvesting. So it's not telling us anything about the Christian religion. It's talking strictly about these people. It is observing the earth at a human level. A piece of architecture that will be created very early on in the Renaissance will be the dome, this part of the cathedral in Florence, otherwise known as Il Duomo. Uh, the rest of the church had been built much earlier, but they had not finished this dome because they could not figure out how to. And it will be up to an architect and engineer named Brunelleschi, Filippo Brunelleschi, who will come up with a methodology to build this dome. Until then, no one had attempted to build large domes on buildings since the Romans. Uh, in Western Europe, it'll be since the Western Roman Empire, there will be a handful of domes made in Constantinople, but certainly not this kind of giant freestanding dome. By the way, just to get an idea of scale, you can see right in there, those are people. You can pay rather large amount to go up into this dome and get a magnificent view of the city of Florence. But you can also get a close look at what an architectural marvel this is. I found a good video that describes what Brunelleschi did in this dome, and I'll be sure and link that. Another display that reflects a lot of what is going on in the Renaissance is a fairly large painting by the artist Raphael, and it's called The School of Athens. And it's in the Vatican, and it reflects the interest that even the artists had in the ancient Greek philosophers that people had not read. This is a wonderful grouping, allegorical, because not all of these people lived at the same time, and there's a few goddesses in it, etc. But it's an allegorical painting of all the great ancient Greek philosophers. So it displays what Raphael thought about them. And he's giving them little tasks or things that reflect what they worked on. But given the pride of place, right in the center of the painting are two of the best known philosophers, Greek philosophers. The older man on what's your left is Plato, the younger man is Aristotle. And they are holding their books, although neither one of the men wrote a book like that. They wrote on scrolls, but it's um, that's something that I don't know if Raphael chose to ignore or did not know about. Anyway, uh, but it is describing this new interest in the ancient Greek thought. Another cultural transformation of the time will be in the field of natural philosophy. That is the old term for science. They didn't start using the term science until much later at the time. But one of the most uh, relevant and um, influential groups of scientists that are going to grow out of this period will be astronomers. Uh, the astronomy, or actually, as it was back then, astrology was something that if you were an educated person, you learned astronomy or astrology. And even physicians at this time would cast horoscopes to find out what was the best way to treat their patients. So uh, educated people understood uh, as astronomy in a certain way. The way that it came down to these people was in fact, and this is all the way through the Middle Ages, was in fact a theory of the cosmos as being a uh, terra-centric cosmos. That means Earth-centric. It means that the uh, people of the time understood the Earth to be round. That wasn't in question, but to be fixed in place, and the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars all went around the Earth in order to explain the movement of all of these. Now, that view comes out of an Aristotelian view that comes from the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who surmised that the earth is the heaviest element. He believed in the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and that the cosmos was made out of these spheres. So, of course, the sphere to Aristotle was the perfect shape. So the earth must be in the perfect shape, and it's made out of earth. Consequently, it is the heaviest, it is the center. Water is a little bit lighter than earth, so it rides on the sphere of the earth. Air is, of course, around us. You know, they knew about wind and everything like that, so they envisioned air being all around us. And then outside of that air was fire, the lightest of the elements. Those were the stars. That was the sun and the moon, etc. So the actual framework of how they understood comes through Aristotle to an early natural philosopher by the name of Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE. who comes up with the design of the cosmos as the Earth being in the center, and the moon going around the Earth. And then outside of that is the sun going around the Earth. But all of the planets went around the sun as the sun was moving around the Earth. And they saw the planets as being extremely small. And then, of course, the stars were outside of that in their own sphere, and that sphere was moving as well. So that's how most of the Europeans in um, would in the Middle Ages and going into uh, the 17th century, 16th and 17th century, understood their cosmos. Well, the Roman Catholic Church had been having some problems with their calendar. It wasn't quite working correctly. And so they had a mathematician, a Polish mathematician by the name of Copernicus, to redo a lot of the geometry that Ptolemy, the older astronomer, had worked out, uh, and to figure out, why the calendar was off. The calendar had gone off by several weeks. That what the church supposed to be, say, the spring or the vernal equinox, was now not at the same time that it was supposed to be, according to the calendar. It all has to do with leap year. Um, Copernicus works out those ideas, but as he's working out those ideas, he is going to be looking at Ptolemy's model and saying that does not quite work. He had very good mathematics um, as far as his geometry was concerned. And he works out a model where the sun is in the middle of the solar system and everything goes around the sun, including the earth. His mathematics did not give a perfect answer, but very close to how he envisioned it. But Copernicus will not publish this idea in his own lifetime. He will ask his friends to publish his work about this after he's dead, because he is afraid of the church questioning his ideas and deeming them heretical. He did not want to go down that path. So during Copernicus's time, he had mentioned these ideas, and this is the 1550s. So it's still a very important part of this Renaissance period. Um, as the 16th and 17th century goes along, we see more improved mathematics. We see people going back to the ancient Greeks and their mathematics and understanding those better, even to the point uh, of figuring out that, yes, Copernicus is close, not quite. Um, about 50 years after Copernicus's death, an Italian physicist named Galileo Galilei is going to take up Copernicus's ideas and work on them through observation. Copernicus is working strictly mathematically, strictly on paper. Galileo takes a fairly new technology called a telescope. And he doesn't invent the telescope, it had already been invented. But what he does is, rather than use it during the day to look at distant objects on land, he points it up at the stars. And he starts looking for evidence that will support Copernicus's ideas. And what he finds are such things as the moons of Jupiter, which to the very low power, considerably lower power telescope that Galileo had, they were still visible and he could tell they were moving. He turned his telescope on the moon and saw the shadows of the craters, and realized that if the moon was its own light source, as everyone supposed it would be, then it wouldn't have shadows. It would be totally illuminated all the time. And so he works out a plan for how the moon goes around the earth, and that's what creates the shadows on the sun creates the shadows on the moon. Uh, he also turns his telescope on the sun. Don't do this. It takes special lenses. Uh, uh, Galileo actually smoked up his lenses with a candle. You know how candles make the glass around them smoky? Well, he makes his own telescope lenses smoky and looks through them and looks at the sun and finds that the sun is not perfect as people had supposed. He sees sunspots. He's the first person to actually see sunspots and try to figure out what they are. He thinks they're clouds. He's not quite right. The science of sunspots is fascinating, but it's just at its birth with Galileo Galilei. But Galileo tries to publish his ideas. He thought he was going to get away with it because he had some very important patrons who were helping him to do his science, and he was a friend of the Pope. While that man had been a bishop and a priest, and they had known each other, and he thought he was going to be okay because he was a personal friend of the Pope. But that did not help him. Uh, and even though Copernicus is going to publish his works, some of them, uh, he's going to be called up as a heretic. Now, Galileo Galilei, when he faces trial as a heretic, being forced to, look at his own books and say, do you still hold to these theories? Galileo will recant. He will say no. Um, and so, even though he had a friend in the Pope, even though he had published these works, uh, he is forced into uh, home arrest by the church, and his books are banned and some of them burned. At the same time, Galileo is publishing his ideas. There is another very advanced mathematician in the city of Prague named Johannes Kepler. Kepler is going to be working at the same time as Galileo, a little bit after, um, considering the movement of heavenly bodies. He's a much better mathematician than Copernicus and Galileo, and his work shows that the movement, the orbits of the Earth around the sun and the moon around the Earth and the rest of the planets, uh, the observational data that he uses shows that those orbits are not perfectly round. That's what threw Copernicus's math off. Copernicus was only dealing with perfectly round orbits. And Kepler says, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. The observations put, the Earth at a certain place at one time and then a certain place at another, and it doesn't make a perfect circle. Kepler works out the mathematics for the heavenly bodies to be moving in an oval, not a perfect circle. And his data, his conclusions are right on the money. But because Kepler is a Protestant, there's plenty of Protestant printers in the 17th century who will be happy to print out his ideas. So it is Kepler who publishes about the three laws of planetary motion, and I'll get into those in the lecture. So we see gradually these men building upon each other until we get to the granddaddy of them all, Isaac Newton, um, the physicist and mathematician and astronomer uh, who was living in London, teaching at Oxford, I believe, Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two. Uh, and his ideas about the planetary and the movements of the planets. He's trying to come up with an explanation as to why their orbits are the way they are. And he comes up with an idea that it's probably this thing that he calls gravity. But he's dealing with mathematics that are so much more complex than even Kepler's. He has to create a new form of mathematics in order to do this advanced work. And this is calculus. Now, there was another man working on the same problems in continental Europe. I believe his name is Leibniz, who came up with calculus at the same time. Um, but Isaac Newton published first, so he generally gets credit for calculus. And his book, uh, Principia, is what it's called. He lays out all of his ideas about astronomy and physics and gravity, and he comes up with the really the first laws of physics. He truly brings the idea of astronomy into its own as a fully fleshed out and important um, uh, science. Uh, Here's a wonderful map, and you can see that the Europeans have been exploring a lot. Now, as far as accuracy, no. We see South America as being weirdly shaped. Africa doesn't look so bad except for this northern part. Europe, not so bad. Part of the problem is the map maker is attempting to map a three-dimensional object, a round object, on a flat piece of paper. And this is, of course, the problem that all maps of the world have, is developing a flat map for a round sort of sphere. So it's a little bit difficult, but you can see by uh, what he is putting down that there's lots of questionable things. I mean, what the heck is this? Uh, and all of these thousands or hundreds of little islands in the Pacific that obviously are not there. Um, and of course, North America, what is it? So not very well fleshed out, but he's taking the information that he can get at the time in the very earliest moment of the 16th century. So what's happening because we've got these new sciences coming out? Well, when we look at the old natural philosophies, astrology, and of course, alchemy, these were not astronomy so much, but alchemy as a science was generally developed in secret. alchemists wanted to have their own secrets, because if they actually managed to do what they planned to do, and that was to turn one element into a different element, see also turn lead into gold, then they'd make a fortune, of course. So, science oftentimes was kept in secret. Sometimes for the hope that uh, whoever makes the new discoveries would make a lot of money, or because, in say, in Galileo's time, he was afraid of the church, and Copernicus as well. So, um, these societies that did not value this open engagement with science are going to fall somewhat behind. Whereas in England and in Paris, we're going to see, well, the Royal Society in London, and in Paris, we'll see the Academy of Sciences. And these were places for scientists of all disciplines to come and share their observations, their discoveries, to argue about important points, and just to spread scientific knowledge. And some of these were even attended by the public, that the public was welcome to come in and observe these lectures. And the idea was to spread scientific knowledge as far and as wide as possible. And we call them the Royal Society of London because the crown put money into it. The crown of England put money into it. And in Paris, the Academy of Sciences, the King of France is going to pour a lot of money into this. And it wasn't just to spread scientific knowledge for the joy of scientific knowledge. They created very practical and important ideas out of these. They're going to be experimenting with things like the vacuum. Um, the understanding the vacuum, how it works, what the principles are, is going to lead to the steam engine. Um, so many of the things, these little experiments that are being demonstrated in the Royal Society, in the Academy of Sciences, there will be another one in Berlin, um, and these academies are and societies are going to be creating, in many ways, very practical steps forward. They will also publish magazines and other literature, books, etc. Here's the printing press again. That is going to spread this information even wider. Now, part of what they are going to be sharing will be raw data, uh, and sometimes that raw data was collected by women, oftentimes who were the wives of men who were scientists, who had helped them or had done some of the work on their own. However, they will not be allowed to teach in the universities or be part of these societies. So they were uh, kept out of the system. They were not officially recognized. However, a few will get a chance to publish, such as Maria Kunitz. She just will not uh, be a part of these societies, which is a huge shame, because they were missing out on so much. But that was the patriarchal aspects of the time. So we can see a growth of universities. These universities are going to be so important in spreading this information, because that's where you get these uh, natural philosophers trained in what they needed to know, and then um, get them into these societies and actually experimenting. So you can see that there's quite a bit of interest in this in the areas we think of as Germany, in France, northern part of Italy, but not the southern part of Italy. Not as much in Spain. Now, uh, judging by the numbers of universities, etc., um, you might think that England was not in competition. That would be wrong because these were very large universities and they had some stellar, absolutely incredible people, such as Isaac Newton. Um, so you can see quite a bit of this knowledge is building over the course of those 200, 270 years. One of these practical things that I spoke about early was the invention of the vacuum. Um, how did it work? And we will see publications where they will be making drawings uh, of how to create what they're talking about. I believe this is a one-way valve that could only air could only escape one way, and they put water into this system that it was sealed, and then it was heated up, and the gas was allowed to escape. The water vapor, much of it was allowed to escape, and then they cooled it very quickly, and that created a vacuum because heated steam expands, and then when it's cooled, it collapses. But there had been an escape of water vapor, and so what collapses is smaller than what had been in there before, and that creates a vacuum. And they were able to show um, through demonstrations that it was quite a force. And as I said, understanding vacuums, how they're made, is going to lead directly into steam powered engines. The first piston driven engines are going to be using this um, aspect of the vacuum. They'll be heating up water, getting water vapor, pouring cold water on it so that it collapses, and using that vacuum to push a piston up and down. And then that piston is going to do work. It's going to work on a rocker arm, and eventually they'll get it moving an axle. So, as we're moving through this scientific revolution, as it's called, in the 17th century, we're going to move into a moment that is called the Age of Enlightenment. It is not enlightenment that we think of in terms of um, the spiritual aspect, such as Buddhism, uh, the idea of gaining enlightenment through uh, meditation. This is kind of the opposite. This is the enlightenment through education and through application and through understanding the philosophy behind it. And this is, in essence, a birth of not just collected knowledge that becomes science, but the methodology that becomes the scientific method. And the two men who are credited with developing the scientific method are Rene Descartes of France and Francis Bacon of England. So here we have those royal societies and the Academy of Sciences paying off. Francis Bacon first. Bacon was an official in the court, the English court, and his idea was that one way you could advance science, one way to advance science is by doing experiments. So, Francis Bacon I hate cap locks. Oh. Francis Bacon is going to believe in experiments as a way of gathering knowledge. So, and he believes in physical experiments, actually doing work. We call this approach empiricism. Hmm. Empiricism. And that is basically a fancy term for doing experiments. But this leads to um, a methodology we call induction. So Francis Bacon's idea is essentially the inductive method of the scientific method. In other words, do those experiments and create your conclusion based on induction. Rene Descartes was a very different philosopher. Rene Descartes believed that he thought that experimentation was okay, but one needed to question everything. And that way, he was a very much a product of the Renaissance and the period after the Enlightenment. He believed in questioning everything. And then when you got to the very point that there's nothing else that you basically could uh, extract as being not part of what you're looking at, then you've got the moment at which you can start understanding what you are questioning. He believed the senses were unreliable. He actually was very interested in optics, but he also knew that even though the eye is fascinating and optics are interesting, he knew that the eye could be very easily deceived, and he felt that the other senses were unreliable too. So his problem with empiricism was that there is always a chance that your findings might not be correct. And so the best way to come to your conclusion was to question everything. And so his methodology is known as deduction. That he believed that one needed to take all of the information and observe it very carefully to make sure It is all logical to apply mathematics to it in order to make sure it is working correctly. And so his ideas of deduction and Francis Bacon's ideas of induction both are married into the scientific method. The idea of coming up with a hypothesis, creating an experiment, doing the experiment, gathering the data, and then examining it through the eyes of logic and mathematics, coming up with your conclusion. Um, and so those two men are credited really with coming up with this self correcting method that we call the scientific method. Descartes was an important philosopher as well as a one of the men who devises the scientific method. He comes up with some interesting concepts such as Cartesian dualism. And this comes right from his ideas that you cannot trust your senses. Uh, his concept is that the mind and the body are entirely separate entities, and one can and should question the other. Um, some interesting ideas at that point. Oh, I got to clear. So that was intellectual process progress at this once. Now we'll look at some of those very practical ideas put into use. Um, and that is the change of the state, creating a highly centralized state, and getting away from feudalism. So we're going to take a step away from feudalism in terms of how the state is run and in terms of things like warfare. Warfare is no longer mounted knights fighting against each other. With the advent of the gun, the musket, then you replaced the very expensive man on the horse and with all the armor, and you have now recruits. Many of them um, have only a minor amount of training uh, in firearms. It doesn't take people that long to learn how to fire a gun, and so the sense of armies grew larger and larger. And the only people who could afford to have armies was a highly centralized kingdom. So the power of the king becomes greater and greater. Uh, those who could not pay for the firearms, could not pay for the men, could not pay for the gunpowder. Too bad, so sad. And so smaller kingdoms, principalities, states are going to be taken over by these larger centralized states who always have a greater and greater need for money. So you take over somebody else's tax base. Now you've got a whole bunch of new people to tax, new products to have, and new recruits for your military. So it no longer pays to be a very small country when you're surrounded by these very large centralized states. So we'll see sometimes fewer and fewer castles, but more fortresses. Fortresses are built differently than castles. Um, and we'll see a very big change of tactics. And we'll see larger and larger armies, and occasion they'll be besieging towns. So the whole change of armaments, etc., is going to change the way everybody fights wars, because you always have to match what the other people are doing. That the old game of rock paper scissors, that's true in warfare as well. You want to bring, if the other guy's bringing a rock, you need to bring paper. If the other guy's bringing scissors, you need to bring a rock. Um, and so, if your neighbor is building up a large army based on muskets, you have to counter that. And you either have to figure out, how to protect your people, or you have to invest in muskets and a large army so that you can fight. So that's political changes that are happening based on the changes of the armies. But there is going to be a huge shift in um, how people think. And this is one of the intellectual and religious aspects of life during this time. And that is the Protestant Reformation. I don't like to call it a Reformation. From the studies I've had of this, I like to think of it as the Protestant Revolution, not a Reformation. A Reformation implies that something was broken and it was fixed, but it still stays the same entity. What is happening is that something seemed to be broken in the Roman Catholic Church to some people, but rather than fix it and stay in the church, they start their own church. So that's not reforming the old church, that is creating a new church. It is a revolutionary movement. But when the Roman Catholic Church was the only accepted religion in Europe, that meant that each king and each monarch had to be legitimized by the Roman Catholic Church. Um, and that was this exchange of power. The church would legitimize the ruler, and the ruler would protect the church. But we will see that there are going to be movements back and forth in the early 15th century, especially in the Hundred Years' War, over who controlled the Roman Catholic Church. Who was the protector? Was France the great protector? Was England the great protector? Was the Holy Roman Emperor the great protector? It was going back and forth. And so we are not seeing a very unified front to protect the church. It becomes part of the struggle between these highly centralized monarchies. At the same time, in order to deal with these highly centralized, powerful monarchs, uh, the Pope himself and the church itself must deal at the same level. You don't go uh, hat in hand begging to these various monarchs. You deal with them as equals. And so the church has to gain power, has to gain prestige. But with this, it's very expensive. And so the church needs more and more money. How does one get that? Uh, Tithes, and of course, In the beginning of the 16th century, we run into the idea of indulgences. This was a certificate one could purchase from the church. It was considered a good work to purchase these certificates. And what these certificates promised was that there would be prayers said for your family members, the people who purchased these indulgences, their deceased family members would have prayers said for them so that they could get from purgatory to heaven. These concepts that the Roman Catholic Church had, that only a handful of people were ready for heaven. Most of the deceased population made it into purgatory, which was kind of a waiting area, unless they were really bad. And then, of course, they went to hell. Um, and the papacy made a huge amount of money on these selling of indulgences. The church also made a huge amount of money selling the offices of the church to the highest bidder. These are the seats of the bishops. Um, so some popes made money that way as well. And to the average person, the average worshiper, to see the pope as acting exactly like your king doesn't work well with your theological ideas about Jesus of Nazareth and the poor carpenter and loving your neighbor and giving to the poor. All of a sudden, that kind of stuff seems to be going out the window with these very powerful popes acting in this very elevated sort of way. Well, one of the people who is going to protest against the selling of indulgences and the work of the papacy is a monk by the name of Martin Luther. He is not the first reformer. There had been a Protestant movement before Martin Luther, but those primarily had been uh, ended by the church. The Roman Catholic Church did not allow for various people, um, uh, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, a whole range of people who wanted to fix the church but could not, or the church actively sought them out and had them condemned as heretics and burned at the stake. Uh, but Luther had a couple of different things going for him. One, he had a very firm um, set of beliefs. One was that uh, only the Bible was the highest authority in the church, that one had to read the Bible and understand it, and that uh, in order to do that, everyone needed a Bible, and Luther pushed to have the Bible translated into people's own languages. Um, and so he's not going to be the first, but he will make it very, very popular because of the printing press. All of a sudden, people could get the Bible in their own language because not everyone learned Latin, um, for a less for an inexpensive price. And of course, the person who translated the Bible was Martin Luther, and he is going to use the ideas that had grown up about textual criticism during the Renaissance to compare the older Greek uh, Bibles to the new Roman Catholic Latin Bibles and basically say, I'm going to look back on the old writings of the early Christian church and use those to interpret Scripture. And Martin Luther's interpretation of Scripture was basically that good works were not enough to get into heaven. One only needed faith in order to get to heaven. So you didn't need to do all of these things that the Roman Catholic Church said you needed to do. Those are called the sacraments. Martin Luther says you don't need all of those. You just need to read the Bible. You just need to be baptized, and you just need to profess your faith. And that was it. And of course, that printing press, the availability of the printing press, not only churned out Bibles like crazy, but churned out pamphlets that put out Martin Luther's ideas in simple to understand ways, allowed people to argue about them and spread these ideas. Um, so, so affecting the literature, giving out a standardized message that people could understand that was widely disseminated. And Luther had another weapon, so to speak, and that was he had support of many of the German princes, uh, monarchs who had small territories, who felt that the church was not supporting them sufficiently, especially with these very strong neighbors that the church did support very strongly. So these German princes were willing to follow Luther and stop sending money to the church, but keep the money locally. And so Luther is going to pick up a huge amount of support that way. And the church and the Holy Roman Emperor are not going to be able to stop Luther and to stop the Protestant movement. Um, and so, for the first time in a very long time, the Roman Catholic Church had opposition in their own European area. Here is one of the power of the printing press, or actually this is a woodcut. Along with the pamphlets, they put out woodcuts and propaganda. And this is anti-Catholic propaganda that was put out by a follower of Luther. And there's little details in here. This demon is sitting on an indulgence. Um, he's holding the coffer that the money would have gone in for the indulgences. And there are popes being gathered up by demons so that that this devil could digest. So it's full of all of this interesting symbolism that people would have of the time would have been interested in seeing and probably would have picked up on the little details. This reform movement, the Protestant movement, is going to spread all over Europe. There will be pockets throughout Europe of people who support it. Uh, but in England, there will be some support of Martin Luther's movement, or actually a later movement uh, that is going to be popular in Scotland. However, in the England Central, it will be the doings of Henry VIII who will break his kingdom from the Roman Catholic Church, not because of anything Luther had said. Henry VIII was actually very anti-Lutheran to begin with. Um, but Henry will form his own church, the Church of England, in order so that he might be the head of the church and do certain things that he wanted to do. Divorce his wife, for one thing, take over church lands, make a huge amount of money over taking over church lands and turning them into his own lands. So the Protestant movement will be in England, but it will get there a very different way. Uh, in Switzerland, which will have a very tolerant attitude towards religion, followers of Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, John Calvin, will basically open up centers of the Protestant movement. Calvin will take over the city of Geneva, and his followers will be the leaders of the city of Geneva. And uh, Calvin will spread his ideas. Now, if you have a religious movement that says each person in the movement can read the Bible and interpret it as they wish, you probably can guess we're going to have a lot of different people finding a lot of different interpretations. Well, John Calvin is one, and he is going to form his own uh, strain of thought in the Protestant movement behind certain ideas such as predestination, the idea that he gets from the Bible that only 144,000 people will be going to heaven and everybody else will not. And nobody knows who those 144,000 people are. Um, but his strain of Protestant thinking will become very popular in places like Switzerland, in Scotland, in various other places. Oh, in France. The Roman Catholic Church, now facing opposition, is going to decide to reform itself. Some of the things that Luther complained about, the church will fix. The church will pour money into educating not just the regular Catholics, but the priests. Some of the priests were pretty much illiterate. But they will also bolster up the traditional Catholic doctrine. So they will work very hard at multiple different levels. They will work very hard with the kings that are still Catholic to make sure they stay Catholic, and they will work to improve the relations uh, with the laity, with the average worshiper, and they will work to spread things like education throughout the church. Um, One of the ways they're going to spread education is creating a new religious society, a new religious order, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, um, and the Cistercians. And that order will be called the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits, and it will be started actually by a former uh, military man by the name of Ignatius Loyola. Um, and the Society of Jesus will be um, will be tasked with the job of converting non-Catholics into Catholics, number one, and number two, education. And the Society of Jesus will be spreading out throughout the world, trying to convert people in Japan, in China, in various other places. They'll set up missionaries, but they will also set up universities. and seminaries and places for people to study. Georgetown University over in Washington, D.C. It's a Jesuit university. Notre Dame in Indiana, that is a Jesuit university. Washington University in St. Louis, a Jesuit university. Loyola Gonzaga. There are many, many Jesuit universities in the United States and throughout the world. So that was part of their mission. But you can see the divisions, the what we call the confessionals, different confessionals, are um, mind-boggling as far as who's got power where. Much of France, the Italian peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and Ireland and Bavaria, those all stay Roman Catholic, predominantly Roman Catholic. In other areas, there are some penetration of reformers, not a lot. Um, there is also uh, the growing Reformed faith, the Protestant faith, and some areas where it's completely dominant, such as up in Prussia, in the Scandinavia, and in England and in Scotland. Uh, but you can see it's not clearly divided. There are patches, which meant that there was a lot of friction. So that's going to lead to warfare. Uh, the the growth of the Reformation movement, especially Calvinism, will lead to quite a bit of warfare in France. The leadership of France will be sternly Roman Catholic, but there will be a lot of pockets of fairly wealthy people in France who will be Calvinists. And that's going to lead to a multi-year civil war, starting with the Bartholomew Day Massacre, in which a Protestant is going to marry the sister of the king. Henry of Navarre is the Protestant who's going to who's going to marry the sister of the king, and so the Protestant, all of the people high up in the Protestant movement are going to come to France, to Paris, for this big fancy wedding, and the mother of the bride is going to uh, use this opportunity to start massacring Protestants. And the wedding takes place on St. Bartholomew's Day, so it becomes known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and thousands of Protestants were killed during this, and this starts open warfare between the Catholics and the Protestants. Eventually, um, the King of France is going to kick all of the Protestants out of France. It's going to happen in a few years. And these are Huguenots. Uh, and they will have to go to places like Switzerland or the United States. Uh, the colonies of North and South Carolina are a principal area where they're going to settle. So the French Huguenots are the ones that make it to America after the king kicks them out. There will also be the Dutch War for Independence from Spain. The Dutch will be predominantly Protestant, but they will be ruled over by the Holy Roman Emperor, who is married into the Spanish royal family. So that's going to be a fight. There will be a civil war break out in England in the mid 17th century. that the Parliament of England will not want any sort of Catholicism. And in fact, they will favor a very stern, plain type of Protestantism. And the King, Charles I, is going to want to be more open towards Catholics and towards the non strict Protestants. And for that, there will be a civil war, and the Parliament will arrest the uh, the King, Charles I, and have him executed, chop off his head. There will be uh, a Protestant who will take charge. His name is Oliver Cromwell. Who will fashion himself as the Lord Protector of England. He really actually becomes a tyrant. Uh, and he dies after a few years and a lot of killing, especially in Ireland. And the Parliament eventually asks for the monarchy to return. Um, and they will bring in the son of Charles I, Charles II, who will attempt to restore the monarchy. He dies, and his brother James II takes over. But James II is clearly has Catholic leanings, and the Parliament cannot have that. And so they, pardon me, bring in a uh, Protestant king and queen named William and Mary. Mary had a clear claim to the throne. William was already the king in the Netherlands. And there was a very close relationship between the Netherlands and England at this time. But by around 1688, the Parliament will have restored the monarchs William and Mary. The University of William and Mary down south is named after them. And they will also instigate a constitution and a Bill of Rights. So this is 1688. This is almost 100 years before, this is 100 years before the American Constitution is written. But a lot of our ideas in our Constitution come from not just the British Constitution, but the religious fighting that happens around this time. The people who wrote our Constitution, that First Amendment about freedom of religion, Congress shall make no laws respecting religion, that comes out of all of this violence I've been talking about, because this was a violence of not just separate Catholics and separate Protestants, it was state motivated violence. So the founders of the United States wanted to steer clear of that. So by not having a state religion, by allowing everyone to worship as they pleased and follow their own conscience, they were trying to avoid this kind of overt violence. So the violence was just not in uh, England or France. We will see the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1619 between Catholics and Protestants. However, the line is not that clear, because we will end the war after 30 years, one of the most bloody wars in Europe had had until the 20th century. Um, it became more about political alliances. The King of France is going to become an ally. The Roman Catholic King of France is going to become an ally with the very Protestant King of Sweden, I believe. So um, it's not, the 30 Years' War is not a clear cut war of religions. It is a war that's going to try to determine who is going to rule more than how they're going to worship. It will end with one of the big important peace treaties known as the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and it will allow some margins of freedom of religion in Germany. But it also is going to try to create a balance of power between all the states in Europe. The idea being we've fought too much all this time. Let's see if we can work something else out. It's also becoming horrifically expensive to have these giant armies. This is the beginning of when we get giant armies in the field shooting at each other. Um, and it is disastrous. It doesn't work permanently, but it helps. It ends, at least ends the 30 Years' War and helps a little bit. So by the treaty or the Peace of Westphalia, we're going to see our kingdoms kind of lining up the way we're familiar with them now, with the exception of the Italian peninsula and this area we know as Germany. It is still very broken up into little bits and pieces. What these highly centralized states are going to allow for is a rise of a method of ruling known as absolutism. In this method of politics, it's not really politics at all. It is a method of ruling in which the king or the czar is going to be the single head of government, and the legislative, judicial, and executive branches are all under this person's direct control. That means that the treasury, all of the military power, all of the power to tax the people, everything comes um, comes under the purview of the king. This means not listening to the nobles. At best, in France, the nobles kind of develop into uh, the leaders of the military and the administration. But as far as a parliament, Louis XIV never calls one. So he doesn't have to share power with anyone. But this makes the state very big. Uh, and it there's at the time with the technology, it is very difficult to collect taxes. So the idea was to be able to make money, but these kings, generally speaking, uh, once they stop getting new territory, their coffers are going to start emptying out fairly quickly. This absolutism is going to happen in France. It is going to happen in a large way in Russia. Russia was basically a very large area that had a very different culture than the rest of Europe. It was Russian Orthodox, so it was a different type of Christianity. It was Russian speaking, so a different language group. They used the Cyrillic alphabet, which means that the language was harder to learn for everybody. Uh, it had its population base was in the western part of the kingdom of the empire, and there was not a lot of people in the eastern part. Siberia was very difficult to get to. Um, so it was a very different looking sort of uh, empire than everywhere else in Europe. But Peter the Great, one of the more interesting people in European history, will become Tsar at the beginning of the 18th, end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. And he will be the first Tsar who will ever travel to Europe. He will have he will have his own diplomatic voyage, but he will go incognito. He will go in disguises. But everybody knows who he is because, well, he speaks Russian and the few other little bits of language very poorly and with a very heavy accent. He's also not hard to miss. He is well over 6 foot 4 inches tall. Um, so he stands out in a crowd, quite literally, and he's spending money like crazy. But he's interested in finding out about Europe, how to build boats, how to do this, how to run a modern army, and he finds out from France how to run a absolute monarchy. And so he goes back to Russia and, as the Tsar, tries to westernize Russia, the court culture, the military. He tries to take the military into becoming one that's run by cannons and uh, guns. The court he tries to form into a bureaucracy and military leadership where they had never been that way before. He even insists that Russian men shave off their beards because men in Europe did not have beards. That one didn't go well as at all. But Peter's going to try to, as this cartoon shows, Peter's going to try to turn the Russians into westernizers. And so Russia, uh, starting in the time of Peter the Great, is going to have contested um, cultures. The culture of the westernizers, the people who support Peter and want to learn, look towards Europe and be more European, and the Slavophiles, the people who want to keep Russia a unique uh, culture. So it's westernizing is popular with some, but certainly not with all. One thing that Peter does do is fight quite a few battles and extend his territory out all the way to the Pacific. It's going to take quite some time to get all of this area acquired. This is also the time that eventually they will acquire Alaska and hold that for a while. But it is an extraordinarily difficult place to rule uh, just because it's so big and the weather is not all that conducive. Um, the major food growing regions are down here in Black Russia. This is the area we now call Ukraine. Um, so he might have an extremely large empire, but there's not a lot of people here. So there's a very small tax base to the east. Another player after the 30 Years' War will be the small kingdom of Prussia. Uh, they had kings who were interested in developing their military because they, in fact, were a fairly small kingdom. They wanted to protect themselves. Uh, and they developed the best trained, best equipped army in Europe. Uh, and when they weren't fighting, the army, the military were the police. And when they were fighting, they had an extremely aggressive foreign policy, i.e., taking land at their neighbor's expense. Um, so the Prussian king's power was entirely in their army, and they spent a huge amount of time and effort and money building up this army. Prussia will eventually become the core of the building of the nation we now know as Germany. So it started with a very military, uh, positive uh, kingdom. But England's going to take a very different approach. England will never become a fully absolutist crown. Um, because of the strong English Parliament, because it had grown up as a decentralized kingdom, that the king did not have all that much power, and the aristocracy, the members of Parliament, had the bulk of the power. Uh, and they took the right of the kings away to tax and to spend money. And so it is the parliament that could dictate how much money to raise, how they were going to raise it, and where they were going to spend it, and what laws were going to be important and be followed. So, um, definitely a very different kind of ruling. In fact, when William and Mary take the throne, they have to sign away uh, their rights as monarchs for taxation purposes, etc. The Parliament is also going to form, in order to take care of the money, the Bank of England, um, in which the funds are going to be more flexible and handled by an outside entity that's still under the control of Parliament. Um, but their the English monetary policy going forward from this point is going to be very different than the rest of Europe's, and the way they're going to handle it as a corporate matter is going to allow England to develop in a very different fashion than the rest of Europe. But one thing they do uh, develop as part of the parliamentary system is the two-party system. Basically, a somewhat liberal wing and a somewhat conservative, although those terms, liberal and conservative, are not used at this moment. Um, but the English Parliament has had, since this time, the idea that there will be parties and that the leadership of the parliament comes from the party. Uh, the leader of the parliament is the prime minister, but people don't vote for the prime minister. They vote for the party, and then the party elects from their um, from their leadership, their prime minister. It's a very different way of doing things than we do in the United States. Uh, so, in essence, the parties are much stronger. And the parliamentary systems throughout Europe are going to develop more in those lines than in the United States, where we have the um, direct voting for president or direct voting for electors for president. So, um, what we will see in this application of knowledge, of science, and of questioning is developments of those things that the Europeans need to move off of their area to start things like trade and colonization. So it takes, uh, it's not an accident that they do this. It takes investment in science, investment in navigational equipment and ships. And that is an extremely expensive way to do this. And so um, we'll see those people who win the race now to spread out to get colonies, etc. People who win are the ones, the countries, the kingdoms that pour the most money into this kind of development, or come up with ways that private entities can do this uh, under grants from the crown. This is how the colonies in America are going to be formed. Many of them are formed by private companies that are given monopolies by the crown and given land by the crown. So um, it's not just you sail into a place and plant a flag and it's yours. It's a lot more complex than that. But they have to go through the steps of being able to navigate uh, and not only finding your way there, but finding your way back. And that takes an investment in maps, in compass, in astrolabes, and sextants, and the people who learn how to use them most effectively. So that is a look at chapter 17. It is an exceedingly long lecture, and I'm sorry about that. I hope you broke it up into a couple of uh, pieces, but look forward to discussing this with you in our next class. I'll see you later.